Hello, and thank you for joining us for another Monday Moment in Matthew. This week we are finally bringing to a close the Sermon on the Mount as we look at the last 9 verses of the sermon. So I invite you to read along with me now. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who has built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. So let's just kind of recap the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, you have the Beatitudes, which are describing the type of individual that God is seeking as one of his servants. In verses 13 through 16, we have a reminder from Jesus that that we are the light of the world and the salt of the earth, which gives glory to the Father, because the Father is living through us if we're imitating the same characteristics as verses 1 through 12. In verses 17 through 20 of Matthew chapter 5, we have Jesus teaching that he has not come to abolish the law. He has not come to contradict the law of Moses, but rather to fulfill it. And then from verse 21 of Matthew chapter 5 through the end of the chapter, he begins to relate sayings from the old law and sayings from the scribes and the Pharisees, and expounding upon them to teach the proper attitude that is involved. You get to chapter 6 and verses 1 through 18 are 3 actions in which we need to draw closer to God and not be about self through giving, through prayer, and through fasting. And then you have in verses 19 through 34 a emphasis on focus. Is your focus on the earthly realm or on the spiritual realm? In chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, it's, are you hypocritically judging? Are you looking at someone else without looking at self first? And then in verses 7 through 12, you have Jesus talking about asking and seeking and knocking, and that being in accordance with the plan of God. Verses 13 and 14 of chapter 7, Jesus talks about there are 2 ways. All of the Sermon on the Mount fit into one of these 2 ways. If you do what Jesus says, you're following the narrow way. If you do what the world says, you're following the broad way. And then you have verses 15 through 20 that we looked at last week, and the fruit that is seen by false prophets and false teachers. Well, that's going to be those that are following along with the world. You have heard it said, and this is what leads from that. But I say to you. And so now we have verses 21 through 23, in which Jesus talks about that there are 2 types of people on the day of judgment. There are those who are going to be told, depart from me, I never knew you, those who work lawlessness. And then there's going to be the other side. And these workers of lawlessness, we need to understand that one cannot be lawless unless there is a law to contradict. What is the law? Well, in verse 12 of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, whatever you do to another, or treat another as you would like to be treated, for this is the law and the prophets. And what he's saying is not, well, if you don't want to get people back, then you get people back, and that's going to be okay by the law of God. No, he's talking to an individual that has their will planned with the will of God. And so in this lesson, in this sermon, when you get to verses 21 through 23, and he says those who work lawlessness, it's those who are going against the law of Moses, going against the prophets. And what Jesus does is he's showing them that even if you are working acts of righteousness, the very things that maybe we were talking about in Matthew 6, verses 1 through 18, you can still be counted as lawless because of the way you've not kept the full law. And then we have verses 24 through 27, which talk about 2 foundations: the rock, which is built upon Jesus' teaching, this whole sermon, and the one who does it, or the sand, Jesus' teaching and the one who does not do it. And we can look at these instances. We can look at people being told that they've done good works, but they've not done everything they should. We can see fruits from trees and understand that a pear tree is not going to give off a pecan, and a walnut tree is not going to give a plum. We can look at the fact that a narrower way is going to be the way against the world, and the broader way is going to be the way of the world, because the world wants everyone to go down that path. And so we can understand that a house built on the rock is going to be solid, is going to be firm, is going to last. Whereas a house built on sand, that foundation is going to crumble. That foundation is going to move away. And so we need to understand from this entire sermon, what Jesus is doing is he's summing it up in several different ways from Matthew 7:13 through the very end of the chapter. And Jesus is showing how an individual needs to respond to this sermon. So what foundation are we building on? What are we going to hear on the last day? What type of fruit are we giving off? And which path are we on? Are we on the way of the world, or are we on the way of the Lord? Verses 28 and 29 are very important. When Jesus finishes his teaching, the crowd's astonished. These are things that they can understand. This has not been a hard sermon to hear. This is a simplistic sermon, but has such meat in it. And they're astonished because he's not teaching like their scribes. He's teaching as one with authority. Every time I read that, I think of verses 15 through 20. When he says that you will know them by their fruits, you will be able to know these false teachers by their fruits. Here's the thing, folks. Jesus was noticeable because of his teaching. It was unlike anything they'd seen before. He taught as one with authority. In chapter 8, he's going to be seen as one with authority by a Gentile. Matter of fact, Matthew chapter 8 and Matthew chapter 9, Matthew's going to put a focus on the power of Jesus and how this fruit of his ministry proves his deity, proves he is the Messiah that was foretold. That's what we're fixing to get into starting next week. But I want you to notice, people were able to tell a difference in Jesus because of his message. And his message is very simple, but it's something we all need to take to heart and follow. And so I hope you've enjoyed our study through the Sermon on the Mount. It's taken a few weeks longer than I would like to, but there's a lot of information here. Next week, we'll get started in Matthew chapter 8. I hope you have a blessed and wonderful rest of your week.